When we have more knowledge than ever, we should be healthier than ever. I'm a doctor. My job is health. We bring in people and we randomly assign them to different diets, watching what happens to them as time goes on. Reducing meat intake does reduce your risk of cancer and reduce your risk of heart attacks and reduce your risk of stroke and diabetes. Meat is dangerous. Getting away from it's a good idea. But the quick soundbite, contrarian viewpoint, is unfortunately taking over.
I've been on a pure carnivore diet.
Eating red meat might not pose any health risks after all.
That is ridiculous. Our job is to do the science. Those of us who are in the medical field have to be patient.
I think comparing meat eaters to alcoholics and smokers is a little bit of a cheap shot.
No, you're right. You're right. Meat eaters have much more problems than alcoholics do. Alcoholism can cause liver disease and colorectal cancer, breast cancer, but meat causes a far greater range of problems. The reason people drink it is because it sooner or later in the brain elicits dopamine. Same is true with every drug of abuse. And the same is also true with meat and with dairy.
And with Netflix and any other behavior. I don't know if you want to compare that to alcohol, though.
No, I do. You're getting a brain effect, and your brain then associates all that other stuff, the smell, the whatever, with what happened in the brain. If you take away that brain effect, none of the rest matters. It's a good idea to look at certain foods as drugs. There's precious little compassion in the world, and there's more than our share of suffering. And if there's something you can do to spread a measure of kindness, we don't want to miss that opportunity. You can transform this world. And my thought is, let's not be shy. Let's put the damn thing to work.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is...
You would have seen Dr. Neal Barnard in the documentary films What the Health and Forks Over Knives. He's always talking about the benefits of a plant-based diet. And you know me, I spent last year on a completely 100% vegan diet when I ran my Ironman race with John Joseph, and we made a movie about it called Iron Mind. Since then, I've incorporated some animal products back into my diet, and I went head to head with Dr. Neal, arguing about the latest movie Game Changers that he was involved in, and some of the science and pseudoscience and some of the things I thought that weren't true. It was a really healthy debate, and I really admire Dr. Barnard on all of his research. We talked about diabetes being caused by animal proteins, Alzheimer's disease potentially caused by your diet, hormonal issues, and all sorts of things that are really relevant. I'm a big fan of the plant-based diet. I don't know if it's right for everyone, but I like a healthy debate, and that's exactly what you're gonna get with this incredible episode with Dr. Neal Barnard. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Dr. Neal Barnard, the American nutrition researcher, author, and health advocate. Your work promotes a plant-based diet and has been featured in the vegan documentaries What the Health and Forks Over Knives. In 2011, you were inducted into the Vegetarian Hall of Fame. Your upcoming book, Your Body in Balance, explores the new science of how hormones are wreaking havoc on the body and a solution that improves health, reduces pain, and sheds weight. Dr. Neal, welcome to London Real.
Thank you. Delighted to be here, really.
Great to have you here. First off, what's it like coming to London? Is this a city you know very well? And, you know, how are some of the food choices here, and how do we eat?
It's great to be in London. I have to say, I love this city. I don't get here nearly enough. Although I have to say, I have a little bit of PTSD about London, because I was here for several days, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, during the McLibel trial. Do you remember when there were these activists who were leafleting outside of a McDonald's, saying the food is unhealthy and anti-environmental, and McDonald's sued these activists, dragged them into court for what turned out to be the longest running civil trial in English history. So I was brought over to testify on behalf of these leafleting activists saying, the food really does leave a bit to be desired. So anyway,
wow.
Having been grilled by a man in a wig has left me with some...
I missed that. It was off my radar for some reason.
Oh yeah, no, it was a big thing.
And how in general, does the British diet compare to the American, or some of the choices, or do you notice anything when you're here? Like, okay, there's this or there isn't this?
It's changed over time. British beef gave way to a lot of vegetarian options before anybody else. There was the veggie burger that was ubiquitous. And I would say London was ahead of the rest of the world with promoting plant-based diets. But then America started catching up. And anyhow, but every time I turn around, there is more and more, there are more and more options, and here perhaps more than anywhere else.
Yeah, and I know you traveled to France quite a bit, and you're saying in the last few years, like, it's just a thing. Like, you have options when you go there. 30
years ago, it wasn't that way. I remember I went into a restaurant in the south of France, and I was looking at the menu, and in my kind of broken French, I was saying, what do you have? And I explained to the server that I didn't eat animal products, and she said, "Mais c'est bizarre." And I was back at the very same restaurant a couple of years ago, and then I noticed all the way up and down the menu, they had these little V's for their végétalien choices. So things are changing there too.
Yeah, things are changing, and I just saw a post from Nimai Delgado, who's the vegan bodybuilder who was in the movie Game Changers, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And he's in Greece, and he's holding up a veggie burger, and he's like, the last thing I expected on an island in Greece is to have this option, So there's, everybody's waking up. Everybody knows people want these options as well. I was told by vegans when they come to Britain that the choices of, locally produced vegetables are just really high. I think this country has like one of the highest concentrations of all these different types of organically grown vegetables because of the weather and things like that. So everyone always says there's like a lot of great options here.
There are, and also, first of all, the agriculture here is wonderful, but secondly, it's also a bit of a melting pot, especially London. There must be 200 different cuisines represented at restaurants all down the street. So you'll have no shortage of choices.
Yeah, British food is no longer bad. Don't believe the hype you hear. It's all good now.
Yeah,
There's a lot of choices. You and I actually grew up with a similar background, and you don't know it yet, but I'm going to drop this on you. I know you grew up in North Dakota, and your grandfather was a cattle rancher. Is that true?
Grandfather, uncles, cousins, and my dad as well, up until my dad was old enough to vote with his shoes, and he hated raising cattle. And so he left, and he went to medical school.
Wow.
And then he came back to the Midwest, and he became the diabetes expert for Fargo and all of eastern North Dakota. But I got to tell you, we still ate like we were in the cattle business. It was every day, roast beef, baked potatoes, and corn. Except for special occasions when it was roast beef, baked potatoes, and peas. That was it. It was a very limited diet, and it was very meat heavy, and my dad kind of paid a price for it personally because I don't think he ever really recognized what food could do for him or his family, and he didn't put it to work in his practice. For him, diabetes treatment was load up that insulin syringe. We're going to do the best we can with your diabetes while you're alive, and it was not something that attracted me, I have to say.
Isn't that fascinating how medicine cannot sometimes see what's right in front of it, and then a generation later, your work is all about, hey, what about the diet? And animal products, can cause diabetes, not the story everyone hears about sugars and starches. Like, does that ever surprise you? Because you're a doctor and you're in the field, probably trained very similarly to your father, and yet there was that strange disconnect.
I never once heard my father say that anybody ever got better. He would come home, it was 6 o'clock, he'd sit down his bag. I never once heard him say, the patient came in, his diabetes is gone. Never. And of course now, we see that all the time. Right. And of course the answer is not a magic pill. It has to do with rearranging the contents of your plate. But of course it comes from something we've been exploring for many years, which is what really causes this disease? How can I change what's going on inside the cells of my body so that the diabetes process can reverse? That's something my dad didn't know. We know it now, and the answer turned out to be much more simple than loading up an insulin syringe.
It's fascinating, because like you said, what's in the syringe, let's stick some more things in our body, and yet the simple, slightly different choice of foods in your mouth could have a massive effect.
Well, diabetes is not a metformin deficiency, any more than a high cholesterol level is not a Lipitor deficiency, or high blood pressure is treated like a lisinopril deficiency. The patient comes in, and instead of helping them to understand how they got there, we hand them a prescription. And some of those prescriptions are a good idea. But there's a lot of times when, if we address the disease process itself, that patient's life is just transformed.
Yeah. Well, look, I want to talk about that. I also want to talk about my plant-based year last year. My grandpa, Benedict, which was my mother's father, had a feedlot just outside of Phoenix, Arizona. And he was a cattleman all of his life. And a feedlot, for people that don't know, is like 10,000 head of cattle being fed right before they die with like a high concentrate of grains in order to get their weight up, and then boom. And I remember as a kid going to visit the feedlot, and all I could remember was how bad it smelled, because it was just really bad. And it was these animals about to be killed. And I remember we would take a half a cow home every year, and we would literally drive it from Arizona to San Diego. And I grew up around this. And funny enough, Neal, I remember my brother and sister kind of started going vegetarian when I was a kid. And my grandpa, I mean, he almost had a heart attack. I mean, he later had a heart attack, but he just didn't know how to process that back in the 80s, that anyone would think that way,
But it's enough to make you a vegetarian. I remember when I was a kid, my father had left the cattle business, but we nonetheless drove some cattle to the stockyards in East St. Louis. And as we were bringing the cows off the truck, you could see the look in their eyes. They're scared. Of course, they're a product. They're just, their value is just based on the pound. But you can look in their eyes and you can see a scared animal, and they were messy because they'd been pushed all around in the truck. Some of them were injured. They'd come down and you'd think, is this really civilization at its best? And I have to say, I think we can do better than that.
Yeah, I guess it was another one of those things like, you just eat what's on your plate, and you just kill these animals because that's what we've always done. So.
And you think you have to.
Yeah.
And some people believe then, and some still imagine that you can't get protein without it, or whatever. Culture has a tremendous amount of momentum, and it really keeps us going.
Yeah, I think
in a not very helpful way.
Yeah, most people have no idea or would never admit that most of their decisions are based on what they see, and they just repeat other people's behavior,
Oh, logic plays almost no role in human behavior. I really mean that. When a person plans their breakfast, they don't think, I'd like to have maybe 15 grams of fiber and could use some beta carotene. They don't do that. It's culture, number one, what you grew up with and what your friends do. Noise, number two. By noise, I mean you turn on the television, it's this new product and that new product. And then there's wishful thinking and addictions and money. When people get more money, they start eating in a maybe not so healthful way. You see that in China now, for example. China's got enough money, they can dramatically increase their pork intake, and so diabetes is going up in that country. But no, logic plays almost no role in not only in our food choices, but almost anything else that humans do, unfortunately. But nonetheless, we appeal to that little sliver of logic and something to see if we can turn human behavior around.
Yeah, no, I know. And I remember my mom had me on non-fat milk because that was what was being talked about in the 70s and 80s. It was like, so we were on skim milk because fat was bad, or fat made you fat, or I don't know. And then later, there was always a trend based on kind of what was happening. But I just finished on the cattle thing. Yeah, something probably inside of me thought something's not right here, because it just, if you've ever been to a feedlot, it's just like, it's not a natural smell. It's pretty bad.
Yes.
And there's a lot of death there too, or soon to be death. So, how did that upbringing then kind of take you on the route you're on now? Because you could have kind of been a clone of your dad, or just continued down that path. What was the thing that really switched your
a couple things. One was in later high school, I was an exchange student in Europe for just a summer program. Very short, just a couple of months. I was in northern Belgium, where the language is Flemish, so my high school French didn't help me at all. But I was plunked into a family that didn't share my North Dakota Republican Protestant views of anything, and the kids in the city it was a village. The kids in the village would make fun of me because I didn't speak a word of the language. And the family I lived with, they were lovely, but they made fun of this American capitalist boy who didn't share kind of their values. Anyway, to be in a different family, different language, different religion, different everything, and then to get thrown right back into Fargo. I just got the bends. And for the next year or so, I found myself rethinking all of the values that I'd grown up with. And then went to college, and it was a liberal time with civil rights and so forth welling up. But then, the year before I went to medical school, I had a peculiar experience. I was working in a hospital in Minneapolis as the autopsy assistant. And down in the morgue was in the basement. Nobody would ever go down there. The phone was probably from the 1940s. It would make this big click. You know, the phone guy didn't want to go in the morgue. So, but that was my job. And when a person died in the hospital, I would prepare the body for the pathologist to do the autopsy. And a guy died in the hospital of a massive heart attack, and probably from eating hospital food, but that's another story. So the pathologist knew that I was going to go to medical school the following year, and so he made this a lesson for me every time. So he made this big incision in the skin and pulled the skin back and cut through the ribs and took this huge wedge of ribs off the chest and put it on the table. And then suddenly you see this heart. He says, look in the coronary arteries. They're called coronaries because they crown the heart. He took his scalpel and he opened it, one of the coronaries, and he said, look inside. So I got my gloves on, I poke around inside. And it was not this rubbery, flexible artery. It felt like concrete. And he said, bacon and eggs, Neal. What are you talking about? He said, atherosclerotic disease has killed this man. And then he opened the carotids to the brain, the carotid arteries, the big arteries that go up your neck. Same process there. The renal arteries, the arteries to the legs, the same atherosclerotic process. Okay, he's done. He writes up his notes, myocardial infarction, massive systemic atherosclerotic disease. He leaves. I take the ribs, put them back in the chest, sew up everything, clean up, and I went up to the cafeteria afterward. And they were serving ribs for lunch. And I have to say, I looked at it and I thought, it was just like the body. And the smell of it was the smell of a body. And it was not a human body, but I thought, this is a dead body. And I didn't become a vegetarian on the spot, but I couldn't eat it. I couldn't take it. I mean, I couldn't put it on my plate. And so anyhow, this started to work on my brain. And then I started medical school right after that. And you know, you can't unlearn something like that. So that was, for me, a bit of a turning point.
And this is like 80s, or this
76.
76, wow. So really early. These are new ideas. Not many people are talking about being a vegetarian back then. Or was there a small culture?
I met 3 vegetarians when I was growing up. They were all doctors from India, who my father brought over to the house. And the only reason I knew they were I never heard the word. My mother served roast beef. An hour after dinner, and they had left, and they were very polite, my mother went, "Oh my God!" I thought, "Mom, what is it?" She said, "I served beef." I said, "Mom, you serve beef every night?" She said, "They're probably vegetarian." And that was the first time I heard of it.
Did they eat?
I was trying to remember. I imagine they pushed things around on their plate. They didn't say anything.
Okay. So when you were going to medical school, you were all looking through it at a lens of maybe there's a root of a problem here. Maybe there's a diet is the issue, and maybe that a vegetable diet or a vegan diet is potentially something that's going to help us.
It was that, and also, yes, the health issues were starting to come up. There was growing evidence at that time that cancer was related to what we ate, which was totally new, because we thought it was only cigarettes and genetics, and that's it. And with breast cancer and colon cancer, people started to look at meat, dairy, and others. But I also started to realize, I started to rethink what animals go through. And for my upbringing, that was not something you're supposed to deal with, because I spent every fall with my dad with my 12-gauge shotgun, waiting in the cold for the ducks and geese to come out of Canada. And we would sit in these marshes outside of Fargo, and we'd blow the ducks and geese out of the sky and bring their corpses home, and my mom would fix them up. And you know, we'd go to the rodeo and all of these things that I took as normal and fun, really. But I started to rethink all of these things, and I started to rethink, you know, there's sort of no more animal more gentle than a duck trying to get out of cold weather. Well, why not just admire them?
Right.
Let them go. So I started to think that maybe a more civilized approach to animals might be a good one.
Okay. So this wasn't just science for you. There was also some ethics involved as well.
There was, and it was brought to the fore for me in quite a different way. In medical school, one day the pharmacology professor came in and said, form your groups, next week is dog lab. Everybody knew what dog lab was. It was a required experience at almost every medical school. Half education, half hazing. 4 to 6 students, you take a dog. The dog's like German Shepherd or a beagle. Some dog's not going to do anyone any harm. Put the dog on the table, tape the dog down, then you start an IV and you knock the dog out. And then you pump in epinephrine, norepinephrine. You write the fact that the dog's heart rate has increased. You pump in propranolol. The dog's heart decreases, the pulse decreases. You run an EKG. You put it in your report. You exsanguinate your dog then. You drain the blood slowly out of the dog's body. And you record what's happening to the dog's pulse, which gets thready and then stops. And then everyone looks at each other. I guess we're done. And then at the end of that day, there are trash bags all up and down the hallway. And then you go home and you explain to your girlfriend or your partner, your spouse, here's what we did today. And they look at you with it, you did what? So anyway, the instructor was explaining.
You tortured a dog.
Well, you killed him.
And yeah.
Your first patient. And anyway, when we all knew about this, we all expected it. But when the instructor said next week is dog lab, I said, I'm not doing that. And he wasn't asking me if I was doing it. It was required. But just as he was explaining this to me, a student sitting next to me said, he's not doing it, I'm not doing it. So we had a movement of 2 people who were going to let the dog live. And I made a vow that day that since there are 2 victims, the dogs and the part of the human brain that values life, that dies too that day, I thought, I'm going to save both of those if I can. So we made it our business, and I did make, and have since succeeded at eliminating all of those labs at every single medical school in the United States and Canada. It took me some time to do it, but we have done that. But my point is this, I'm a doctor. My job is health, and that's been my journey. But along the way, you start to discover that if you have no ethical foundation for what you do, your work is bankrupt. And so I think it's important to assert that, whether the potential victims are life forms you recognize and sympathize with, or ones that might be a little bit more new to you.
Wow, that's super powerful. Yeah. I remember the cat autopsies in my high school and like senior biology class, and there were garbage bags all around, and they would, take apart these cats for like months and months and months. And I never did it because I wasn't in those classes. But yeah, again, one of these things you just kind of accept as normal but gross. But most people don't question it. I guess you did.
Well, I didn't question it. When I was younger, I did all kinds of horrible things, just as everybody else growing up does. I wasn't filled with remorse when I was hunting or all these things. But at some point in life, I started to rethink these things and decide that there's precious little compassion in the world, and there's more than our share of suffering. And if there's something you can do to spread a measure of kindness, we don't want to miss that opportunity. The good news is there's a hell of a lot you can do. You can transform this world. And my thought is, let's not be shy. Let's put the damn thing to work.
Yeah. What was the point in your career where you noticed there becoming a critical mass of people wanting to hear your views on plant-based diet? There must have been an inflection point or a certain year where you're like, okay, I feel momentum for people listening to my ideas more than before.
To tell you honestly, I don't think we're there yet. Here's what I mean. Yes, it's true. There are so many people who are changing their diet. Yes, it's true. A lot of people have gotten my books, and I've been on TV, which is wonderful.
And movies as well.
Yeah, that's lovely. I'm delighted to get the word out. But I have to say, there are so many people. While it's true that the number of people who are going in a healthy direction is bigger than it's ever been, the number of people who haven't yet gotten this message is huge too. And I'm doing a lot of work now in Washington with one of the hospitals that happens to be in the poorest part of town. And when I talk with people about why do you have 3 times the colorectal cancer incidence here compared to the rich part of town, there isn't any understanding on the part of the patients, the doctors, the nurses, anybody. So we have our work still ahead of us.
And it's an economic issue as well, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the lower income you make, the worse your health is, and it's quite magnified, right?
Absolutely, yes, exactly. And this is not necessarily, this is not at all people who have decided, I get what you're saying, but I'm not going there. It's not an informed decision. These are people who are victims of marketing and the ignorance of, and sometimes willful ignorance of a government that promotes unhealthy foods on people. What I'm talking about is unhealthy things are subsidized, are dumped into schools. Anyway, don't get me started. But
Yeah. No, it's a good point you make.
the fact of the matter is that I don't think we're there yet. I'm happy with the changes that have come, but there's more to do.
So we've got like Beyond Meat that's IPOing for billions and people are putting it in all the fast food places, but we've also got the lower, say 25% of the population that's getting more obese, more diabetes, and the diet maybe is getting worse in some cases. And you're looking at this and saying, Brian, we're not necessarily where I want us to be.
A couple of examples.
Yeah.
In young people, and by young, I mean anyone up to the age of 49, colorectal cancer rates are rising. And it's not that genetics are changing. It's all because bacon is now a fad. You can get bacon-flavored soap. And if you're a young person, you're immortal, why worry about it? The World Health Organization says it is a clear-cut Group 1 carcinogen. Also causes breast cancer. That information hasn't come out. And the big tragedy now is in India, which is the second biggest country on the globe, China, which is number 1. India has a vegetarian tradition that is now viewed by many people as the quaint habit of their grandparents.
Right.
And modern,
and of the poor, maybe.
Modern young people are non-vegetarian, and diabetes rates are going through the roof. And if they are vegetarian, it's also dairy heavy, that you may as well have eaten a pork chop. In China, it's a changing economic situation. When people have more money, they can afford more pork. And in China, it is becoming devastating. Cardiovascular disease is through the roof. Diabetes is way, way up. A country like Japan that used to have the skinniest and longest of people on the planet, and a diet mostly based on rice, and meat was little flavorings, not the center of your plate. There are now so many fast food chains in Japan that breast cancer is up, Alzheimer's is starting to go up, cardiovascular disease, diabetes is up, and also some depression and other things are up. Is it food or is it something else? I don't know. But when we have more knowledge than ever, we should be healthier than ever.
Yeah, I remember I went to Brazil like in the early 2000s, and we've all heard of the girl from Ipanema, but on the beaches, there were just these massive people that were no longer eating the way they probably had eaten for the last 100 years, and it just was really noticeable.
The girl from Ipanema was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes recently, and I'm kidding. Well, the country's on fire because in the Amazon, what's that about? It's not that lightning struck, it's that people set the fires to clear the jungle in order to grow feed crops for more beef. And not just in Brazil, but everywhere else. So yeah, we're kind of making a dog's breakfast of things. But the good news is what you put your finger on, which is that more people than ever do have this message. And it's just like smoking. I used to smoke cigarettes along with my burgers.
Me too.
And you can, you're not stupid. You know it's going to cause cancer, but you take your time to quit. And finally, there became a critical mass. And now, if you light up at somebody's home, they would be scandalized. In a restaurant, you can't even do it legally. So the meat eaters will get there too.
Right. I mentioned Beyond Meat, and I mentioned that a lot of these fast food chains are now taking on these meals. Is that a net positive, or is that just also propagating bad eating habits in these fast food places?
Clear-cut net positive. Absolute net positive. Now, who it's a positive for is either the meat eater who came in and thought, I'll try that. Let me see. I mean, that's for that person to realize you can have something that's not meat. That's great. Or a family member. A couple brings in their 7-year-old kid, and your child is imprinting on what you do. And a 55-year-old guy who's on the exam table after a heart attack, in his heart, is a 5-year-old kid who learned the wrong things to eat that got him there. So when those are there and they are marketed and people realize they taste good, that's all positive. The only thing I would say though is they're a door. They're a transition. They're sort of, for a heroin addict, your methadone, a beef addict's methadone is the veggie burger. It gets you over your addiction. But once you get there, you want to go further because there are so many other choices that are tastier and over the long run healthier as well. But no, the veggie burgers are a good parachute out of meat eating.
Right, but if you keep eating veggie burgers your whole life, you still might end up in the morgue with same problems, right?
They vary. There are some that are pretty high in fat. They've got so much coconut fat in there, you can almost hear your arteries snapping closed. There are others where the fat content is low. It's just basically grain, and you top it with ketchup and a pickle, and it's hard to indict it.
Yeah. Although I don't know if a burger is ever the way forward. But okay, you also mentioned something else. You live in D.C., and maybe like recently there's kind of a culture of exaggeration, maybe brought on with the Trump administration. I don't know. Maybe it's not fake news, but this thing of, like you said, people can say something's true and it is. Like bacon's good for you, which some people would say it is, but you're saying, talk to me about this kind of freedom that everyone seems to have now to say something or exaggerate something without the scientific facts. That didn't exist, say, 6 years ago, 4 years ago?
I don't know if it's Trump. And I mean, nowadays people have, on a daily basis, they just assume that the things he says are not true. And even his supporters will say, well, that's just him. He just makes stuff up. And it's kind of endearing in a way. I mean, here he is with his hand in the cookie jar and crumbs all over his mouth saying, what? I didn't take those cookies. It's just kind of sad, but...
it's also becoming more accepted, isn't it?
That's the issue.
Yeah.
That's the issue, that if it's acceptable to just make things up and stick to them, that's a problem. I'm not sure if it's social media has contributed to this, where what really matters is the headline, not the depth. But we're seeing this in medicine now, and a huge scandal we had just recently was headlines everywhere said you don't have to reduce meat for good health. There are new guidelines out. I'm not sure how much this traversed the Atlantic, but in the United States it was all over every newspaper. What it was the Annals of Internal Medicine published a series of meta-analyses where you crunch the numbers from previous studies into your new meta-analysis. And although they found that reducing meat intake does reduce your risk of cancer and reduce your risk of heart attacks and reduce your risk of stroke and diabetes, they also did studies showing that meat eaters really value meat. And their conclusion was it's not worth it. The reduction in your cancer risk and heart disease risk and stroke and diabetes isn't worth it if it means you got to change your diet. So therefore, go ahead and eat meat. And that was such a man bites dog kind of headline that the newspapers really ran with it. If you read the studies, you realize nothing has changed. Meat is dangerous. Getting away from it's a good idea. But the quick soundbite, the contrarian viewpoint is unfortunately taking over.
Okay, that's a good point. All right, let me talk about my experience last year. I want to get your thoughts. Then I want to talk about game changers, and
sure.
I also want to talk about diabetes and a bunch of your other IP. So last year, a guest came on my show. His name is John Joseph. He's the former lead singer of a hardcore punk band called the Cro-Mags that was big in the 80s and 90s. And he had become a Hare Krishna monk back in the day, and had actually started a vegan diet about 35 years ago, way before many people were talking about it. He also went on to have a crazy career as a lead singer and a crazy crack addiction and all sorts of other stuff. But he used to smoke crack and drink wheatgrass juice, he told me. So
go figure.
Yeah, go figure. And so he came on my show. He's been sober for many years now, and he's been running these Ironman triathlons, like about 10 full Ironmans, serious stuff. And he challenged me to come to New York City and train with him. And when I was there, he said, Brian, I got this half Ironman coming up. I want you to do it with me, and I want you to do it on a plant-based diet. Now for me, I had never gone really plant-based. I had played around with Meatless Mondays. I had a lot of people on the show before, like Dr. Greger and all sorts of other people talking about the diet. But when John did this to me, I was like, okay, I'm in. So I went 100% plant-based last year. In about 3 days, I did it. And John kind of gave me some guidance, took me to some great places in New York City. At the same time, I'm training a lot. I've never done an endurance race. I'd never had done distance swim or bike or run. And John said, Brian, you're actually gonna feel better. You're gonna have less injuries if you go plant-based. And I was like, that doesn't make sense to me, but okay, I trust you. So I came back to London and told my wife, and she's like, what are you talking about? She's from Bulgaria, where again, there's not a lot of, she didn't grow up with a lot of vegans. But we figured it out. And all of a sudden, she starts finding different substitutes, sometimes meat substitutes in the form of soy, and then later, maybe not, maybe just all these other wonderful foods. And we kind of fell in love with vegetables again, and I was like, wow, these things taste really good, and there's all these different options. And once I realized I had to eat more, because at first I just wasn't eating enough, because you have to eat more. Also, I was training a lot, but I just needed to eat more. I got into a really good rhythm. Despite at one point my B12 being low and I had some B12 injections, otherwise everything was fine. And then also people said my B12 couldn't have dropped in a few months anyway, so it was probably already B12 deficient. So I did it. I actually ran the race. I finished the race. I did really well.
Yeah.
And so it was a great experience, and everyone thought I was gonna have a steak and a beer at the end of the race, and I didn't feel that way. I actually was like, I feel good. So I told myself I was gonna keep it up, and I kept it up. And I kept it for about 4 or 5 months, and then I started thinking, am I doing this because I'm dogmatic, or am I doing this because this is the long-term lifestyle and health for me? And I have a history of doing things to death in my past. I can be very dogmatic, and sometimes it takes me in good places, and sometimes it makes me try to drink myself to death. So I have both things, and sometimes it can make me do a great show like this. So at the very end of the year, I said to myself, am I doing this for dogmatic reasons, or is this really the right thing? And I said, you know what? I'm not gonna hold myself to this restricted diet. And I said, I'm gonna try some things. And I also went down the ethical thing too, because I think the more vegetables you eat, the more you think about the health of animals.
Right.
And so I also started thinking about farm factory animals, and I'm like, I don't want to be a part of this. And I had flashbacks to the feedlot. I don't want to be a part of that.
Right.
Something me as a 4-year-old kid knew this was wrong. Okay, so I get to the end of the year, and I'm like, all right, I'm gonna have a bit of sushi. And I had some sushi, and like my body was like, okay, I think this is okay. And my stomach was like, this is okay. And so now I have certain types of animal proteins. And for me, I feel better and I feel stronger. And I still have a lot of vegetables. I still train a lot. I still don't have any factory farm meats. But for me, I don't know. I don't necessarily have the scientific proof one way or another, but this feels like the right diet for me. What do you think of that?
Well, first of all, what you did is amazing. And it sounds like you trained up quickly. You reaffirmed what so many other people have found, which is that it's totally counterintuitive. People imagine if I'm gonna bulk up, I've got to be eating meat. And then of course they realize that all the biggest animals are herbivores and so forth. But what you accomplished is wonderful. That's amazing. And also you did it for long enough that it's there for you. So if you decide, okay, I brought back the sushi or whatever it is, but I'd like to go back into not having animals on my plates, you're an expert in it. You can get back there if you want to. There was never a person, and I'm not going to speak about you for a minute, I'm going to speak about somebody else.
Okay.
There was never a smoker who didn't feel better lighting up a cigarette, or a person with an alcohol issue who didn't feel better having a drink. They know it's better for them to not smoke or to not drink at all. But when they have whatever that thing is that's tickling their brain, they do feel a little reward to it. And when they're not having it, they kind of miss it. Now, everyone's different. I have to say for me, when I got animal products off my plate, I think I went through about 2 weeks of doubt and thinking, what would I miss? But then it was gone. And now, not only do I not miss it, I don't want to be anywhere near it. It's like quitting smoking. I don't want some tobacco near me anymore. It's just creepy. And for me, fish, for example, we think of fish as protein. Well, what is it? When I was a kid going into the lakes in Minnesota, and we were hooking fish on our lines, we're playing the fish. The fish isn't playing. The fish is trying to survive. And if you look at how people obtain fish, if it's through fish farms, it's frankly sickening. There's a new documentary out called Artificial that talks about hatcheries and fish farming. It will make you not want to eat it. But then the wild caught is even worse. Some of them are like taking a lawnmower on the ocean floor and just destroying every species they ever could. So these bigger issues are there. And when they weigh on us, we can decide, all right, I've been around, I've tried all the different things, and plant-based diet is always glad to welcome people back.
And I appreciate the analogies between drinking and smoking, and I've stopped smoking and stopped drinking. It took me a long time, but I finally have. But I don't think that analogy necessarily plays through into meat. I just don't. And I'm not convinced that completely avoiding meat is the most healthiest thing to do. I think there's people out there that can do it, and maybe they have a genetic propensity to do it, but I've had a lot of vegans that have sat in that chair that have come off that. They did it for a few years, and they found that it just wasn't sustainable for them. And so I still am not sure if it's the right diet for everyone. And I know as soon as you go plant-based, you want to make everyone go plant-based, and it's all the right thing, but I'm not sure. And I'm still not sure of the science. Now, I know you are sure, but I'm just not sure. And I don't consider myself to be completely unscientific, but that's just a strong feeling I have.
Two things to weigh in. One is the science, and hopefully we'll talk about that because we've been funded by the US government to actually test these things. And the data are very robust for the effect of a vegan diet on diabetes, weight loss, cholesterol lowering, that kind of stuff. But in the broad scheme of things, human beings, whether we like it or not, are great apes. And great apes don't eat ice cream, and they don't eat cheese, and they don't have yogurt. They don't have dairy at all. And they are, for the most part, herbivores. Now, there are some exceptions, but the great apes are human beings, and chimpanzees and gorillas and orangutans and bonobos, that's it. They are not dogs, they are not cats, we're not carnivores. The exception is with chimpanzees, you'll see maybe 4% of the chimpanzee diet is they will go up a tree and kill a monkey, which they do by biting into the monkey's head. It's creepy. Anyway, apart from that, they're really herbivores. And human beings are herbivores, but the fact is, we've been such restless herbivores that we were happily living in Eastern Africa, and then we had the bad judgment to leave that area and go into places like New Jersey. And along the way, there were times where we went over the Bering Strait that plants didn't grow. And so we would do our best to eat what we could and survive. But we are still herbivores with herbivorous coronary arteries, and when you compare people, almost regardless of any other aspect of their diet, those people who avoid animal products are the healthiest and longest lived. And I'm speaking not just about heart disease, but things like Alzheimer's. Other things you wouldn't think of as relating to diet.
Is there a definite direct link between Alzheimer's and meat consumption?
This is the new frontier.
Okay.
But it really started in 1993 in Chicago. Researchers at Rush University started something called the Chicago Health and Aging Project. They just rounded up people. They didn't tell them what to eat. They just said, what are you eating? And about 10 years later, they started to have enough data to say, suspect number one is saturated fat. And saturated fat is the solid fat that's in cheese and dairy, and meat is number two source. Plants have almost none of it. And the people who ate the most saturated fat had about 3 times the risk of Alzheimer's compared to the others. And then right behind it was trans fats, the artificial fats that are used in a lot of snack foods, pretty much the same effect. And then they started noticing that people who ate more vitamin E, which is in seeds and nuts, and some vegetables as well, cut their risk by about half. So anyway, this research has been ongoing now for a couple of decades, and there's still a lot of gaps, but it appears that a plant-based diet is largely protective. And the reason that's important is when I make a list of all the things I don't want to get in my own life, number one on my list is Alzheimer's, because, and I imagine you've had either family members or friends or relatives where you lose everything. So.
Yeah, it's not pretty. And I mean, we can get to some of the studies later, but I'm always curious, I mean, are the studies really looking at people like me who are active, eating maybe grass-fed meat for small portions of my meals, or are they looking at meat eaters in general who are having Big Macs 3 times a day? I'm always just very curious about the sample size, the study, the length of it, because I don't think anyone is really talking about someone the way I'm eating and pointing the finger out that this specifically isn't working. It's still kind of very big general chunks of data, is the feeling I get. I don't know. Am I wrong?
Well, I think you're raising a really important question, which is how much can I get away with? If I can eat meat, can I just have some? Will it be okay? And if the cow was fattened on grass rather than on corn, will that make a difference? I think those are legitimate questions. Although I have to say, my whole family raised grass-fed beef. That's all there was at the time, and that was a terribly unhealthy. I mean, you're eating an animal's muscle in either case. It is not broccoli. And muscles are a mixture of protein and fat and the occasional parasite that got in there, and that's really what it is. And
Right, but it does have nutritional value. I mean, I can survive on it, right? And it does help me build muscle. I mean, it must.
No, I don't think so.
Not at all.
Well, first of all, you can't survive on it. If you try to eat nothing but meat, you remember the English sailors who all got scurvy?
Yeah, okay.
I mean, that's sort of the Atkins diet taken to an extreme, and somebody realized, wait, meat doesn't actually have vitamin C, guys, and that's where the limes came in.
Okay, fine.
But I mean, there's a lot more to it. There isn't any fiber in that diet whatsoever. There is protein, but the whole idea that meat jealously guards protein is not true. I mean, there's protein. If you ate 2,000 calories a day, roughly, I'm going to say, unless you're training, in which case you're eating 3,000.
Yeah.
If you ate 2,000 calories of nothing but broccoli, not that you would ever do this, but if that's what you did, you would get about all the protein that you need, that the government says you need, plus about 90 extra grams. And if the next day you ate nothing but lentils, you would get all the protein you need plus an extra 100 grams. Plants have enormous amounts of protein in it. But to make it short and sweet for anybody who's just tuning in for just this one bit, a healthy diet is 4 things: vegetables, fruits, whole grains, and beans, or the legume group: beans, peas, lentils. Vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans. And you should supplement with vitamin B12. People can get low. And I mean, meat eaters get low. But I think everyone should supplement with B12, and that's something we can talk about. But that's to me is a healthy diet. And meat doesn't add anything to that at all.
What do you think about these meat eater diets lately? I mean, there's been some famous people like Dr. Jordan Peterson, who's like on all the meat. And I know he had some autoimmune issues, and maybe by doing that helped some of that. But some people are thriving on that. What do you think that is?
It's hard to thrive on that for very long. Autoimmune issues are real. And sometimes when people restrict their diet to a great degree, they end up leaving out whatever food they're reacting to, which is good. If they get away from dairy, my sense is that dairy proteins probably trigger more autoimmune issues than any other food. So getting away from that's a good idea. But I wouldn't go that direction. We in our clinic in Washington, what we do is for an autoimmune condition, we will bring the person to rice and vegetables and things like that, leaving out all the dairy, all the meat and whatever. And very often people get completely better. And then you bring in more and more plant foods to see which ones might also trigger it. Because maybe they're allergic, or not allergic, but sensitive to dairy, but also wheat, for example. Let's test it. So we put it to the test.
Okay, so you think the carnivore diets are short-lived, and you want to see if they can be...
The diet and the people.
And the people, you think so. Yeah, well, I guess to be determined. Last thing I want to talk about, and then I want to talk about the movie. Vegans say they're not harming animals, but the latest argument is that by harvesting vegetables, there's all sorts of animals that they're killing, the rodents in the fields and all of the things that cause and creating the soybeans. I had someone in here who was a vegan for 5 years, and now he's eating red meat, and he said, Brian, when I eat red meat, I kill 1 cow, and I can survive on 6 months on the 1 cow, as opposed to the vegetables that are killing all of these little animals. Just wanted to get your reaction.
That is ridiculous. And
why?
Because the cow isn't ordering room service. The cow is on a feedlot, as you said, and the pigs and the chickens, they are eating soybeans and corn. When I go back to Fargo, you go outside of town, and as far as the eye can see are fields of corn. Beautiful, identical, genetically engineered. And on the other side of the highway, it's soybeans. Beautiful, identical, GMO. No human is eating any of that. So if you're thinking there's mice in the fields and they're all being killed, maybe so, to feed chickens and to feed pigs and to feed cows. So when the cow is killed, that cow represents enormous amounts of agriculture that had to go in to get this miserly amount of meat. This was the argument made by Frances Moore Lappé with her book, Diet for a Small Planet, I think in the 1970s. Also, apart from that, to make that cornfield grow, you need fertilizer, you need irrigation, you need pesticides, and all of that washes into the rivers and streams. And the Missouri River that runs right through the heart of North Dakota picks up all that junk. And the fertilizer causes algae to grow. And as it ends up in the Mississippi, and as it flushes out below Louisiana and Texas, there is now a dead zone as big as the state of New Jersey from all of the fertilizer and the growing algae bloom that then died off and killed everything in the water, thanks to growing feed crops for animals. So the idea that I'm not going to eat that, I'm just going to eat the plants directly, it may be that some animals are killed in the process, but it's nothing remotely like raising all of these crops to then feed to animals to get the tiny little bit of meat out of it.
Okay, point made on the scale, but there are some animals that are going to die if you're a vegan. So there is blood on the vegan's hands to a certain extent.
I have no doubt that there are all kinds of things, costs to almost anything that we do. Certainly a good point. But when a person stops eating animal products, they're making a really good shift. And to the extent that we help other people to embrace that, you're helping animals, you're helping your health, their health, and the environment. I mean, the idea a grass-fed cow is still belching methane, just like the one on the feedlot. And methane is a far more potent greenhouse chemical compared to CO2. So yeah, it's a darn good thing to go on a plant-based diet. But let me again say that for the first half of my life, I wasn't there. I was on that side of it. And when I see my cousins, you will see signs for Barnard stock farms in the Midwest. Those are my family. I love them dearly, and I understand it, and I had a taste for it, and I worked at McDonald's and everything. But at some point, my feeling is it's just a good idea to put that in the history book.
Sure. No, I understand that. I appreciate you addressing that stuff.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.